Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope to convince you why you, wine lover, are someone that the climate needs. So I'm Kimberly Nicholas. I'm a sustainability scientist at Lund University. I come from this beautiful place in Sonoma, about an hour north of San Francisco in the US. This is my parents' vineyard and near the study areas that I studied for my PhD, looking at the effects of wine and climate change on the California wine industry. I want to start by summarizing all the climate science you need to know in almost a haiku, if you don't count syllables too carefully. And that is, it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. This is what the science tells us. There are thousands of footnotes and peer-reviewed references. If you want to dive into the science, I cover it in my book, Under the Sky We Make. And if you want to go straight to the original sources, you can check out these Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, very authoritative and exhaustive and extensive peer-reviewed work on summarizing the science. But if you want to take this as a starting point and say, where are we now and what is it that we need to do? Let's take a look at the next slide. So we have a carbon budget. That's the amount of carbon that we can burn and stay within temperature limits. And the reason that matters is because temperature sets the thermostat for everything for life on Earth. It determines who can live where and how we can make a living, both the 8 million almost humans that we share the planet with and the 8 billion humans that we share the planet with and the 8 million other species that we share the planet with. The issue at the moment is that we have almost exhausted our carbon budget. So take a look at where we are and how quickly we've gotten there. For a long time, humans were not burning much fossil fuels, and we had used very little of the carbon budget in my grandparents' day. By the time my parents and then I were born, very, very, very quickly, the world has used up almost all of our allowable carbon budget to stay within the limits that we know are necessary to support a good life on Earth. At the current rate, we will use up our remaining carbon budget in about 86 months. So we have to make really fast changes to a fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world in order to stop climate change. We know that climate change threatens the future of wine, which is beloved and important, and also of life on Earth. And we know that we are just about out of time. The IPCC says we have a narrowly closing or rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So there is so much at stake right at this moment. And because we only have these few really remaining months of possibility to avoid catastrophic warming, it has to be us who make the necessary changes. Our goal is to limit warming as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. We know that the difference between warming 1.5 and 2 degrees might sound small, but that difference is the difference between life and death for many people and places around the world, potentially including some of your favorite wine regions. We know that there are limits to adaptation, even though growers and winemakers are smart and adaptable and doing all they can. It's not possible to adapt to a high degree of warming. So what we need to do is avoid the changes we can't manage and manage the changes we can't avoid. At the same time, we have to be taking care of nature. Right now, humans have been essentially at war with nature, destroying a lot of the nature we share the planet with and its ability to help take care of us, to recover from stress, to thrive through change, and to provide us with what we need in terms of clean air and water, food, the basic materials of life. So our task right now is to stop burning fossil fuels, to protect and restore nature, and to center human well-being while doing it. We actually know what we need to do to stop climate change. It is simple, but not necessarily easy. As I write about in Under the Sky We Make, it basically involves doing two things: leaving fossil fuels in the ground, so stop burning coal, oil, and gas, and stop destroying nature, shift our relationship with nature from one of exploitation to one of regeneration. And we need to do this urgently, like our life depends on it, like we are serious about not overflowing that bucket that I showed you, that rapidly filling carbon budget that is the atmosphere filling with our climate pollution. We need to do that like our lives depend on it, because they really do. There is so much at stake right now. To do this, to actually make this shift, we need to do a lot of things, but one of them is a mindset shift. And it's shifting from what I call the exploitation mindset. That's the mistaken belief that some humans are superior to others, and that humans in general are superior to and should dominate nature. And these two fundamental misunderstandings, I think, are the root cause of a lot of the crises that we face today. The way we can actually overcome these misunderstandings and build a better world is to adopt these principles of regeneration. Regeneration means to renew, to make better, to improve, and get to the highest level that we can to be our best selves, basically, to make the best of what we have with what we can. And to do that, we need to do three things: respect and take care of and protect both people and nature. So center the health and well-being of both people and nature. Stop harm at the source. So look at systems as a whole and understand what root causes are, and get to those as directly as possible. And third, to build resilience. That's the ability to cope with or even thrive through change. And we know that there is a lot of stress and change, and that's increasing in our world today. So we need to improve and increase our own personal resilience, our ability to deal with setbacks and challenges, our support for each other in our communities, and our local resilience, and the resilience of nature, giving nature the space and well-being that it needs to be able to be healthy and recover from stress, and even to thrive and improve. One principle I think is really useful here is taken originally from the transportation sector, but in the latest climate reports, it's been used much more broadly. And that, I think, is a way of kind of putting into practice this idea of starting at the root. It's called the avoid, shift, improve framework. And I think this is really helpful to think of things in this order. Oftentimes, solutions are focused at the end of the pipeline. So for example, if we're talking about transportation, we might think, okay, we have cars. How can we make cars pollute less? We can make electric cars. That's great, and that's necessary. We do need to get away from fossil fueled cars, and electric cars are a better option for the climate. But the better option is actually to go a step further back and say, wait a minute, how could we replace cars? Or how could we actually even reduce the need for transport in the first place? How could we make neighborhoods and cities that have everything people need within a close distance, so it's not necessary to travel so far where you might need a car to meet your needs? So starting with this avoid and actually reducing overconsumption at the source is a really important step that has really powerful potential. Then shifting from less sustainable to more sustainable options. So from cars, to example, for walking and biking and taking public transit, if we're talking about transportation. And then finally, improve is at the end of the pipeline. So these are the technical improvements to basically continue business as usual, but in a cleaner way. And my point here is to really think about the systems we're a part of, whether it's the wine industry or at work or in schools or neighborhoods, from the systems perspective, and look at what would it look like if we actually address the root causes here. Another rule I want to point out for empowering you to be climate action leaders is to focus on what really matters. And there's this general rule of thumb, the 80-20 rule, which holds that oftentimes it's 20% of the input that causes 80% of the output. In the case of climate, this can be even more extreme. That basically, there's huge disproportion between who causes and who is impacted by climate change. You see that here in the graph on the left, which shows per capita personal carbon footprints. And this here, it's 10 to 50 is the ratio. So the top 10%, which is all of those people earning $38,000 a year or more. So if you're in that group, you're among the 10% richest people on Earth. And we collectively cause half of household climate pollution. Meanwhile, the 50% poorest people cause only 10% of climate pollution. So what that tells us is, if we want to reduce overconsumption and personal carbon footprints, we need to focus on the top 10%. That's where the climate pollution is. Similarly, if we're looking at a national level, it's just 6 countries, the top 6 countries, that cause 2/3 of total climate pollution. So any kind of climate international agreement needs to have these major actors: China, the US, the EU, India, Russia, Japan, the UK. Those are the key players to have on board. And it's similar for the wine industry. So if we look at the carbon footprint, for example, of a bottle of wine, we can see that there is a similar pattern where we can identify what are the areas that cause the most emissions and what are the most effective actions we can take to reduce those emissions. So again, it's really focusing on what matters most, since we know we have just these 86 months to make good use of our remaining carbon budget. Our goal needs to be to cut global emissions in half during that time, these next 86 months, for luxury brands and industries like the wine industry, and for countries in the global north who have historically polluted a lot, like those on the last slide. We need to go even further. So basically, how can we really quickly cut a lot of emissions? We need to look where emissions are and then focus on what we can do to cut them. So in this case here, I've identified these effective actions. In the vineyard, it's about using inputs wisely. In the winery, it's about energy efficiency and investing in renewable energy. Packaging is the single largest source of wine footprints, which is interesting and an exception for the food and beverage industry, or at least the food industry. So their lightweighting and alternative packaging is really important. And transport is the last big piece. So switching from transport by air and truck to rail and shipping, and pushing to make transport fossil free. These are the high impact actions at an industry level for the wine industry. If we look at the roles we can play as individuals and the different parts of our lives, whether that's professionals at work, our private lives as consumers, as investors, as role models, and as citizens, we actually have a lot of power that we can choose to use and that we could be using so much more effectively. And basically, this is what a lot of my work is about. I write about these 5 roles, which is from a study with colleagues that was published in 2021, last fall, actually picked up by the film Don't Look Up and used in their climate action guide. And I've written about it in my newsletter here, and you're welcome to read more about it. But I'll give you a quick overview to get at the highlights. So if we're talking about personal climate action, again, this 80-20 rule holds pretty well, where we see that a large proportion of emissions from the highest consumers, those of us who are way over our fair share carbon budget, where we need to be, we actually need to look at our mobility. That's the majority of emissions. So for this higher income group, most emissions come from flying and driving. And especially the higher income you are, the more emissions come from flying. So if you fly, the fastest way to reduce your personal carbon footprint is to reduce your flying. And especially frequent flyers need to look at reducing our flying. That's a journey that I've been on. That it's a whole nother story, but that has been a fun adventure. And I just want to put this in perspective. We know that as an industry, lightweighting packaging has a lot of potential. If you're producing a lot of cases of wine, it really matters what you, how you package it. And you can make impacts on the industry and beyond the wine industry by pushing on the supply chain. But as an individual buying a bottle of wine for dinner tonight, you can't save very much emissions by lightweighting that particular bottle. And there it's much more important to think carefully about buying a plane ticket, because that is so much more impactful. I've calculated that for the same emissions you cause by taking one round trip flight, for example, from London to New York and back, you could drink 1,250 bottles of fine wine for the same carbon footprint. So that, I'm not recommending you do that in one sitting, but that could probably last you a lot longer than that trip would. So I really want to encourage us to think about where can our choices make the biggest difference, and where is it important to focus our limited time and energy to have a big impact. For the wine industry, and I know many of you are already doing this in taking big steps and being climate leaders. I think it's really important, and I really salute those who have committed to the science-based targets. These are the most rigorous and the clearest designed and aligned with the science targets. I think for targets to make a difference, they really have to focus on what matters. And we can't spend our time doing everything. So we have to focus on the big sources of emissions and the things that evidence shows are effective to reduce them. So make sure that in your climate action and in your targets, you're focusing on actions that will substantially reduce emissions this year, next year, the years to follow. So make sure that you've really chosen the right targets that you're focusing on reducing your emissions. You can also have a big impact on your industry by supporting best practices. And I know that all of you who are here in this conference are committed to that, and that's part of why you're here, to learn from each other. Everyone can have a job that is a climate job. And in fact, we actually need all jobs to be climate jobs. So talking about how industries and sectors can help contribute to climate action, I recommend this report, Climate Solutions at Work by Project Drawdown, that goes into how can professionals in human resources or accounting and in procurement and other parts of a business, how can they play their role to help make the transformations that we need? And finally, I just want to point to this piece that I wrote. I can share the link on the conference website that helped inspire this talk. It's basically translating the high impact climate actions from research for a wine lover context. So putting into context why it's so important for us as wine lovers to care about the climate and to take climate action, because our favorite wines, as well as a lot of other things that we love, are really at stake. And how is it that we as a wine industry, as wine lovers and consumers, can use the power of the stories that wine can tell and the unique and wonderful contribution that wine makes to, to help motivate us and to help galvanize meaningful climate action. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention. I would love to hear from you on my newsletter. I write a monthly evidence-based climate action guide that's available for free over at We Can Fix It on Substack. And I go into all the facts, feelings, and actions for facing and healing the climate crisis in Under the Sky We Make. So I hope to hear from you, and thank you so much.